welcome everyone to the APGRD's next and very exciting reading by distinguished poets whose work should be known not just by those of us who are classicists, but those of us, and I know many of you will be watching, who are not directly from the world of classics, but who follow these poets for very, very different reasons. The two poets who I am tasked with welcoming today are both classicists by training. They began as undergraduates as classicists and have continued in various ways to engage with the classics in their creative lives. And I think in many ways, for those of us at the APGRD, it is the new perspectives that they bring to the classics that have been most exciting for us. Their poetry intersects with questions of the transmission of ancient texts, with inevitably, perhaps as fully trained classicists that they are, with questions of translation and transcreation, as people often say today. They also, importantly, engage in different ways with questions relating to pedagogy. And I think it's these different ways of intersecting with the classics that make their work so striking and so provocative. The two poets are Josephine Balmer and Lesley Saunders, and they're going to speak to us today to their most recent collections, which engage with the classics, Ghost Passage by Josephine Balmer and Nominy-Dominy by Lesley Saunders. I will briefly introduce them now. They're going to introduce themselves, and in fact, they know each other very well, and they're going to, I believe, give us an amazing performance that involves a kind of poetic dialogue between their two collections. First of all, Josephine Balmer. She has worked and reworked in very interesting ways the poetry of Sappho, the poetry of Catullus, the poetry of Ovid, and most recently, the fragments of Aeschylus' Myrmidons. And today she's going to speak to Ghost Passage, which is in many ways a serious engagement with material culture, with Roman archaeology in particular, and Roman London. Lesley Saunders is, like Josephine Balmer, someone who has published very widely. There are so many collections that many of you will be familiar with. And I think what's extremely interesting for us at the APGRD is that Lesley, like Josephine, but in slightly different ways, has engaged in quite exciting collaborations with as many poets, photographers, but also with composers, with dancers, and singers across her career. She is a poet, but she's also an educator, and she's also, like Josephine Balmer, an academic in her own right. And I think it's very interesting, and I'm sure we'll hear rather more during the course of the next 40 or so minutes. One of the reasons why Lesley has chosen to dedicate this latest collection to her teachers. Now I hand over to both our poets, and welcome to you both. It's wonderful to have you with us. And I will join you at the very end of your performance, and hopefully we will have some questions in the chat from those of you who are watching us now. So over to you. I think it's Jo. I think you're going to start.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Fiona. It's absolutely wonderful to be back at the archive. So huge thanks for inviting us and for hosting, and to everyone for coming and listening, whether you're here this afternoon or watching on catch up. Now, rather than reading in two blocks this afternoon, one after the other, Lesley and I got together and we decided to interlock our poems, which we hope will allow them to interact with and to speak to each other, and also make the event, we hope anyway, far more user-friendly for the audience. Okay, well, I'm going to be kicking off things with a poem from my new collection, Ghost Passage, which is literally hot off the press. It's just out from Shearsman's Books, and it's available in all good bookshops now, as I say. Now, this volume explores classical writing that stands outside the usual preconceptions of high literature, tragic, epic, drama, and so on. Instead, it considers the everyday stories of ordinary people, the stories we don't usually hear, extrapolated out from fragmented inscriptions or graffitied everyday objects. And most of all, it concerns the cache of Roman writing tablets, recently excavated during the building of the London Bloomberg headquarters in the City of London. And in fact, the entire collection came out of a project, a collaboration with the London Mithraeum Museum, now at the Bloomberg site, in conjunction with the awesome Lottie Parkin and her staff and students at the University of Notre Dame, USA in London. And I'd like to start with the Bloomberg tablets to take us back and back through time to those earliest days of Roman London. It's 61 CE, and rebellious British tribes, led by Boudicca, have just razed the new city to the ground. But despite the chaos, London is regenerating, it's rebuilding. Writing tablet, Bloomberg Writing Tablet 79, which I'm just going to show you on the screen, if you can see, dates to just about a year after the destruction of the city. So it shows us that London actually survived and regenerated far more quickly than we thought before. And it's inscribed very, very simply, as you can see, with the Roman alphabet. And it's thought that this tablet was used as an educational tool, as a tool for literacy, for teaching British people, British children in particular, Roman letters. And this gave me my starting point for my poem, that of a city rebuilding itself after destruction and war. And particularly as I was writing, at the time I was writing it, I was sort of watching news reports of children in refugee camps desperate to return to schools. And unfortunately, this is a situation that we're now all faced with again. New Roman, Writing Tablet, Walbrook, London, 61 CE. In a charred shack, we learn our lessons. Through the smoke, I can smell sorrow, ramsons, blackthorn blossom drifting across like ash, as the shouts of soldiers shatter our hush, and wagons of the dead still roll on past. We do not want this world, the old language, destruction, put to fire, revolt, flight, death. Our task is to etch a new alphabet, new letters, new tools to rebuild our homes, gardens for us children, games to play, schools. We'll smooth the jagged edge of dialect and salve its gaping wounds in majuscule. A, B, C, the scorched march of New Roman, turning blackened wood into cold white stone. And now I'm going to hand over to Lesley.
Jo, thank you so much for that very moving opening. And I'd like to add my thanks to Fiona and Claire and the team for making this event possible online. We had hoped at one point last year, I think, that it might be live, I mean in person, but it was not to be. So thanks to the team for making it run smoothly. I'm going to read a few poems from my collection Nominy-Dominy, as Fiona so kindly said. And it's a collection which is really about visiting the past in two senses: the public literary past of the classical world, but also my own personal past when I was a young thing learning Latin and Greek at school, and absolutely bewitched by coming across these languages with their huge their magical resource of history and language and meaning and emotion. But the problem, of course, is that both kinds of past are fragmentary and elusive. The risk is that we may misinterpret or misremember even our own personal pasts. And I was very struck by something that the classical scholar Edmund Richardson said on a radio broadcast that I heard a few years ago about classical scholarship, that it's driven by a desire that can never be fulfilled. 97% of ancient literature is lost. We work with fragments, he says. We work with dreams. We work with the longing for lost texts to be discovered, for every broken thing to be repaired. And I think that really kind of encapsulates the mixed emotions that we have when we encounter those pasts. I just want to say how delighted I am to be sharing this virtual stage with Josephine, because I first encountered her work a very long time ago when I was a young woman, and I came across her translations of Sappho, which completely changed my view, A, about translation, and B, about Sappho. But we'll come back to that later. I'm going to start, like Joe, with a poem that I wrote a little while ago when I was working in Kosovo. And the interpreter that I had told me the story of how he and his family had escaped from Pristina, the capital city, and had to seek refuge over the border in Macedonia. And he told me how he had carried his young daughters on his shoulder with a blanket over their heads because they were being sniped at from the mountains by the Serbian soldiers. But then, of course, you know, what we see and hear in the news now just brings these things back into the present day, because the epigraph to this poem is actually taken from the Aeneid. It's that point where Aeneas is fleeing the burning city of Troy, and he says to his frail father, ipse subibu humoris nec me labor este gravabit, I will carry you myself on my shoulders, and the task will not weigh heavy on me. So this is called Asylum. The young women here are headscarved and majestic, and they drive like fury along the city's unmade roads. Do they, in the marrow of their quick bones, remember how one night they were hoisted on their father's shoulders, and the blanket that was flung over their sleepy dark heads like another dusk? How not so long ago a man ran and ran through the ruinous flames, and on his back his own father, still clasping the household gods to his shrunken chest, in case one day there would be a home again to put them in. Not a burnt out truck or fenced in camp on the edge of town, but honey cakes and thick coffee, the evening star to steer by.
Thank you, Lesley. That's such a moving and evocative poem. Now, the following poem that I'm going to read is inspired by the recent discovery not of a writing tablet, but a tiny Roman writing stylus found in the city of London, and it's the implement with which the scribe or whoever would have written on the wax and the wood. And again, I'm just going to show it to you on the slide because I think it's really nice to see these artifacts. Here it is, and you can see it's very, very unique, and it's very special because each side of this tiny stylus is inscribed with this minuscule script. And in fact, it's inscribed in verse. It's a little ditty, almost like a greeting card ditty. And as Roger Tomlin, the great Roman Britain scholar, pointed out, the message seems to be something along the lines of the ancient equivalent of, I went to Rome and all I got you was this lousy pen. Now, when I came to write the poem based on this, the voice that came to me was that of its gift giver. And it was a young woman with her own reasons to feel aggrieved and shortchanged. Keepsake, inscribed writing stylus, Walbrook, London, 75 CE. From Rome, a keepsake to bring you pleasure, a pointed gift so you will always remember. I wish I could have given you much, much more, but the journey is long and funds are short. I'm sure he threw it in the stream. London, I'd heard, was in ferment, packed with pleasure. Fine wines, sweet ale, and most of all, women. Its frost-edged dusk, a lure to warm the bones. My message, sharpened in miniature, would go unread, unmarked. He didn't know there was a further present still to come. From that brief jasmine night he'd forgotten. Those paired hours we shared before he embarked, but I relived my day. How the moon grazed to the sea at Ostia like a polished blade, as each serrated kiss cut time in half. A keepsake to bring you pleasure. 10 days old. Her father in replica, as sharp. Lesley.
So for Jo, it was the stylus that got you thinking. And for me, it's something to do with the grammar, all those conjugations and declensions that I actually loved learning when I was a teenager. So this poem is called Mood, and it contains various grammatical terms within it, which I'm sure you will all be able to get. So no gold stars. In a way, the kind of the metaphor is these terms hiding in the poem, like I imagine the Celtic guerrilla fighters would have been hiding in the bushes while the Roman army tried to advance. Mood. This was advanced study, had me secretly leafing to the end of the primer for the quiet nobility of supines, the weatherproof posture of locatives. Voices in the road, the straight street that runs out to the provinces, rain-pocked sea always beyond, infinite. An uptorn whinbush, a scuff of chalk in the turf are indicative. The army skidding round, hooves stammering on stone, imperative to get the advantage. Scouts grubbing in the grass for particles of knowledge, nothing in themselves, but huge with meaning in the right place. Like this votive offering, a springtime scene, not hard to parse, this optative with its gaping throat and caved-in skull, face down in a fen. Wishful thinking made brute fact. Jo.
Lovely wordplay, Lesley. Thank you for that. My next poem is based on another writing tablet from the Bloomberg dig, and it's actually writing tablet 14, which is actually one of my favourites of the entire cache. And again, I'm just going to show you it on the screen. Here it is. It's actually an address which refers to a house as Catulus's. We can see that down here, Catulo, which makes Catullus, fascinatingly, one of the earliest recorded householders in London. But of course, classical ears, or many ears, will prick up at the name, because Catullus also happens to be the name of one of the most famous of all Roman poets, Gaius Valerius Catullus, who'd lived around a century earlier, and who, interestingly, also mentions Britain fleetingly and scathingly in his verse. And so when I came to write the poem, I imagined that our London Catullus from the writing tablet could be a descendant of the earlier poet with sort of similar creative ambitions, if, as we'll see, perhaps rather less successfully achieved. The house opposite, writing tablet, Walbrook, London, 80 CE. Give this note to the Cooper Juniors, just opposite the house of Catullus. I unpack my treasures of Syrian glass, plates sourced from the slopes of Vesuvius. The walls I paint with frail shoots of grass and a poppy, my own hidden message for those who know the poet, my namesake, a flower fallen at the meadow's edge. I had pictured myself as a pioneer, composing dark, difficult northern poems, as fated one day as my famed forebear. Besides, I'd been priced out of Rome. Yet each word I write, I later delete. I watch the starlings rising up at dusk above the teeming cloud-fogged streets, like a simile slipping out of grasp. I hear the drunken Rhenish equites chant their alehouse verse, swilled in vomit, our bleak reward for 7 months' back pay. My voice is clogged with London clay. All I am here is the house opposite the Cooper, 2 doors down from the brewer. The only lines that come in error, and for them. Barrels, bills, more calls for beer.
Strange how objects can have such, can hold such meaning and evocation. This next poem is called Helmet, and I wrote it for my 3rd grandson when he was a year old. In fact, I think you can probably see his photograph now that he's a 9-year-old behind me. It was inspired by that scene describing the solemn moment. You remember it when Hector, Prince of Troy, was about to go out into battle against the Greeks besieging the city. And he comes to say goodbye to his wife Andromache and his little son Styanax. And he holds out his arms to the boy. But the child is so frightened at the sight of this strange creature with its great towering helmet and horsehair plume, and shrinks away from his father. So Hector takes off his helmet so that he can bid farewell to his son. Helmet. Its eyes are empty, but the brows are wingspans eagling over the low skies of the helmet's gaze, where tomorrow's battlefield sprawls. No wonder the child is terrified. The bronze rings out, a thick male voice sounding through the mask, Wotan, Jehovah, Ogun. This is not the father you love, the one with gifting hands and the look of blue daylight all round him. But if the cap fits, you will learn this new language, how grave and gold it tastes, inlaid with garnets and sagas, sunburnt, sumptuous with works and days. You will see with its eyes how gallantly the world is made.
Thank you, Lesley. I love that, taking an incident from ancient Homeric epic and making it part of contemporary family life. As we saw in my last poem, The House Opposite, some of the most important inhabitants of early Roman London, at least for its citizens, were those involved in the brewing, the distribution, and the selling of alcohol. Now, Bloomberg Writing Tablet 72 contains the fragmentary accounts of one Crispus, an innkeeper or brewer, or possibly an early form of a microbrewery, which detail the consumption of extremely large amounts of beer. So no change there. Now the tablet could date from any time between 65 to 80 CE, But I decided when writing the poem based on it to place it towards the end of that period, during the governorship of Agricola, who's possibly one of the most famous of all Roman British officials. Fortunately for Agricola, his son-in-law just happened to be Tacitus, the famous Roman historian. And Tacitus records how Agricola advanced Roman territory into the north of Britain and then on into the far wilds of Caledonia or Scotland. So it seemed to me that this was a time when his soldiers would surely need a drink or three to see them through. Account. Writing tablet, Warburg, London, 82 CE. Supplied to Crispus's tavern, beer, 5 denarii, 1,000 pints, 7 denarii, 1,400 pints. Night after night, we had the thankless task of keeping the city watered. As soon as one emptied, we'd fill another cask until our streets brimmed with swaying legions waiting on their orders. By all reports, our rash new governor, that ambitious arsewife Agricola, would now march north. I didn't blame them. As a veteran, I knew those roads, the rigid, bone-strewn paths that level worlds while names, careers are built. This was Caledonia, dark, unmapped, uncrossed, its tarns as deep as hidden guilt, its forests trembling like a long-planned trap. Every drop they drained would soon be spilt.
I love how you inhabit the life and the mind of Roman soldiery, because it's so distant from our own experience as 21st century women. And this next poem is also tries to do that thing of imagining what those times and experiences were like. I went to that amazing exhibition about Pompeii. I think it was in 2013. I can't believe it was that long ago. It was at the British Museum. And it made me reflect on the stark contrast between the lives of the soldiers and those exquisite wall paintings, the frescoes. So this is a veteran soldier alone in his home, haunted by the past and thinking of commissioning a new wall painting to distract him from his terrible memories. Wallflowers. You wash your hands too often, you can't sleep. You bang and bang on the glass to be let out, to be let in. Life's becoming dull and hard, rage and guilt and dread. All the old undeads slouching there with you at table, drinking your health in vinegar. Caesar's veteran alone with a view of the painted jays. The months are long, hot, cloudless, so little shade on the endless limestone road with its kill blossoming in ditches. You're stifled. The mind is the scene of crimes. You need a tabula rasa, fresh start. Tear up the cypresses, pomegranate, that kitsch asphodel. Then these to fill your eyes, morning glory, dog rose, plum, the papaver somniferum.
Thank you, Lesley. That's so evocative and atmospheric, but also this hint of coming danger there. Now, my next poem concerns possibly my favourite of all discoveries from the Roman city. It's a small inscribed pewter strip, which I'm going to show you on the slide. Here it is. It was found on the old Roman foreshore of the Thames in 1989 at the Vintry. Now, originally, this is a very thin strip of pewter. It's on display in the Museum of London, so you can go and see it. It's well worth doing. Originally, this would have been rolled up and worn around the neck in an amulet case as a phylactery or a sort of spell against evil. And we can see that this one, rather than in Latin, it's inscribed in Greek, in capital Greek, and the inscription tells us that it belonged to one Demetrius. And now, although a lot of its lines are incomprehensible to us, there's spells, chants, what is really fascinating about this piece is that some of its lines are written in verse, and verse that was actually already known to us. Lucian, the ancient satirist, records that they were popular, these lines of verse, as a supposed charm against evil that was peddled around the empire by a fake mystic, Alexander of Abonotikos, especially during the Antonine Plague, 165 to 70 CE, when millions across the empire died. So here we have a sort of demotic poetry seeping into ordinary lives, if in extraordinary times. And I think that's something that we can really all sort of get behind, that we really understand now, given the events of the last few years. And although I wrote my poem, well, I started it anyway, before the present pandemic, I think it now sort of gives it a forceful resonance. God help Demetrius. Pewter Amlet, Upper Thames Street, London, 169 CE. Friendly gods, divinities, whirl away all heart-pounding, ear-shrieking, breath-piercing, air-carrying plague. Spare us its men-destroying, skin-penetrating, spirit-waiting, flesh-devouring, bone-dissolving, vein-hollowing pain. God help Demetrius. When the watch turned him over, he was rashed, mottled with sores. The same plague and fifth corpse we'd seen that day, each clutching amulets for protection. Their Greek was chalked on doors to stem pestilence with prayer, gibberish. The pus-filled promise of charlatans' charms. And yet those same houses reach most of death, as if enchantments inflamed infection. Demetrius fed our pits. His talisman we tipped in the Thames. Maybe it cost him, but the pewter was not worth salvaging for fear of fresh taint, contamination. All hearts stopped as he twitched. We'd been disarmed, and we'd been wrong. Poetry might save one.
Yes, I just love it. And its resonance, Josephine, for our own times. Isn't it strange how these things kind of come alive in such different contexts? I'm going to leap ahead by several centuries now, because my late mother-in-law gave me her copy of Helen Waddell's medieval Latin lyrics as her wedding present when I got married to her son. And I treasure it, of course, for her sake, but also for the gems that it contains. So very different from classical Latin poetry, but drawing very deeply on its tropes and metaphors. And one of my favorite poems in it is the poem by Alcuin of York, who the churchman and also a poet of the 8th century CE. And it's the lament for his lost nightingale, which could be, because people did keep birds, it could be literally true, but it could also be an allegory for the loss of faith, or perhaps even the loss of love. And there was a notion current at the time that birdsong, like poetry, had an intrinsic meaning, which you needed to be specially gifted to be able to interpret. And there's a beautiful line written by Guillaume de Poitiers, one of the troubadours, which in English, I'm not going to attempt the Provençal, which in English goes, and the birds sing, each one in their own Latin. Alcuin's nightingale, clad in its bird robes, A small soul perches in the night tree, waiting to enter. The windows of the senses can be slow to open. Evening has stolen another day, and soon the concert halls fill with shadows. Under her basque and fishnet, the jazz singer is a muscle of music. Her solar plexus is a membrane between worlds, wold and sky, thunder and lilacs. The bird in her throat rhymes sweetness with sorrow. And at his desk, a poet weeps because he has no Latin. The words for love song, lifelong loss.
That's a very poignant poem, Lesley. Thank you. Now, I'd like to stay with late Latin, here the period we now call sovereign Britain, after imperial rule collapsed here around about 410 to 450 CE. And I discovered the inscription on which the next poem is based, and I'm just going to again show it to you, in a tiny church in Pembrokeshire, in the church porch. Now, there are an awful lot of late Latin inscriptions in this area, but I was particularly drawn to this one. We have it here, and then this is the writing sort of turned around, because it gives us the voice of a woman. It records the voice of a woman, which we all know is a sort of very rare thing in early historical records. It's a very special thing. And I wanted to end on this poem because it seems a fitting place to end this afternoon, as it shows us how the past bleeds into the present and how it's always with us. Borevalis, son of, inscribed stone, Spittal Church Porch, West Wales, 520 CE. I chose the largest slab we could haul. We needed the space for its capitals, lettered down right to left in verticals. I remember watching the new cutter, tracing each one slowly with his hands, squinting at my script, a bleared picture of some far other world just ended, symbols he could no longer understand. As he chiseled, I felt the granite chips fall like our sudden squalls of autumn rain. I saw him smooth down the near edge, patting it softly as if putting a child to bed. And there it was, a dedication, a name, Borevalis, son of, with mine, Junio Vende. I had thought we would be the last who could or want to read that Latin. Yet heads have tilted for a millennium and a half like birds as they passed. The neat assistant from the corner shop, in her pleated skirts and curled up hair, counting kids in and out, except her own. The schoolmistress, shushing her class into all but one of its shrunken chairs. Each maid who slipped their kitchen lock to drop blood-soaked parcels at the lich gate. The shunned, the silent, the toppled saints. Every Sunday for 1500 years, they have paused by us in this place and mouthed our grassy, guilt-gnawed words to make them true. Martyr whose? His mother. To keep them near, to keep them safe. I think Lesley's going to stay in Celtic Britain, sort of.
Jo, that was utterly beautiful. Thank you. And I want to end my reading with an excerpt from an extended poem I wrote about Sappho. And Josephine's translations, all those years ago, of Sappho caught her ambivalent tone of celebration and of yearning simultaneously. You caught that perfectly, Jo, and so this is a kind of tribute to you. And my poem, which is, as I say, quite a long one, I'm only going to read the last but one section. It imagines Sappho as an old woman, more or less in the present day. And she sailed very far away from her own home on Lesbos. She sailed westward to take up residence in a completely different kind of island, the Isle of Inishbofin off the southwest coast of Ireland, where she has come to die. And the section that I'm reading is called Sappho and the Hag of Beer. The Hag of Beer is one of those legendary wise women, a sort of ancestral mother figure, and her famous lament for her lonely old age has been translated by many different Irish poets. So this is Sappho and the Hag of Beer. Sappho's bones are aching. Oh, she feels as old as time, crabby. She's been sitting for hours, one of those slow August evenings, on a folding chair among the lettuces, a shroud of carpet round her shoulders, staring sightlessly at the wild swans and the rain-soaked light. She coughs and spits into a used tissue, shrinks inside her leathers, an old bog body, all wantonness gone. Sheena mena an cailach biera. I am older than the old woman of beer. She turns her face to the low sun and the place where the wild rose hips will come. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you, Fiona, for hosting. Thank you, Jo, for being such a wonderful co-reader and wonderful poet.
Well, huge thank you to you both for such a beautifully crafted performance. And we do have some time for a few questions. And if I can enjoy just for a moment Chair's prerogative and ask you a question that sort of comes out from a comment you've just made, Lesley, and that is I'm very interested in hearing how acts of translation, both your own perhaps and the translations of others, how do they relate to your poetry? And you know, that could be, you know, about process as much as about the product. And I don't know who wants to answer that or elaborate in some ways. From maybe Lesley, you start, because you say in some ways that beautiful Sappho poem you just read out was in part a response to and in tribute to Jo.
Yes, I think it's helpful to become aware, as perhaps one wasn't as an undergraduate, of what it is that translators actually do, especially translating poetry, which is to have to reimagine and to take the language and have a full respect for the original language, and yet to see it as something to which one is responding out of one's own experience and the cultural context of one's own time. Josephine's translations of Sappho, they seem to me to be very fresh and very modern, but they also seem to have a very strong connection with that poet who, for me, until that time, had been more or less a sort of an academic, distant entity, phenomenon. And of course, we have started and perhaps still do think of Sappho as being the poet of fragments, whereas of course she wasn't a poet of fragments. She wrote fully fledged epic poems, some of them, and so there's that whole thing as well of what it is that only knowing a work or a writer's oeuvre through fragments does to our understanding. And Anne Carson's translations of Sappho have taken that to an extreme, which is extremely enlightening. But I think it's that question of how each person or each age remakes an original poet, and what that does to us as poets when we see that whole variety of tone as well as vocabulary.
Thank you. And I know, Jo, yeah, I mean, you particularly, because in some cases you've both translated and then responded in very different ways. So
yes, indeed. I think the question I'm very often asked is, what is the difference between producing a translation and producing an original poem? And I always say the same thing, that for me there is no difference. They are very, very much again an interlocked activity. Translation is all about finding the right word in the right place, or Seamus Heaney says, the only word in the only place, and that sort of bleeds over. That's the same when you're writing a poem. I think that what Lesley says about fragments is very true. It's particularly interesting, but I think as a translator, as a poet, one of the wonderful things about the fragments is the silence and space that surrounds them. And whereas you don't want to interfere with that, you don't want to fill it in too much, it also gives you an awful lot of possibilities, poetic possibilities.
thank you very much. And now we have got questions coming through. The first one, I think, is very much a question for you, Lesley. Thinking about Alcuin's birds singing in their own Latin, could you both speak about the effect of ancient languages, or could you both speak? So it could be very much for both of you, about the effect of ancient languages as both foreign and familiar in your work.
Oh, how lovely. Yes, because if you're lucky enough, as I think Josephine and I both were, to learn ancient languages at school, they go in quite deep. And although my Greek grammar is certainly extremely rusty, it is true that they have become, those languages and the way they kind of fall on the ear, the way they look on the page feels deeply familiar, even though I might be really hard put to it now to do an unseen translation. But their foreignness was partly what captivated me. I think it was almost like that their sheer alien nature as languages on the page was for me an escape as a troubled teenager. Well, all teenagers are troubled, aren't they? But I very much like that idea of the strangeness and the familiarity, because I think that's one of the things that one is trying to do as a poet oneself, is to both make the familiar strange, to kind of strangify things that we take for granted, but also to bring that distant, really quite hidden world, however familiar we think we may be with it, to bring that into the present, as both Josephine's and my poems have unwittingly done, because of the situation that we understand now in Ukraine, and it's that resonance of these extraordinary circumstances and events, which kind of continues on into our present, whether we want it to or not. It's there. Thank you for that question. It's lovely.
It is a really good question. I think for me, Latin was much more familiar. Obviously, I was a Catholic, so I used to Latin in church in ordinary sort of situations, whereas Greek seems so much more alien. And I think Lesley's right; it had this real appeal of the foreign, of the exotic. What's interested me with all the artifacts that I've been looking at from Rome and London is how many of them are actually in Greek. And that's sort of suddenly this jarring thing to find that, you know, so many ordinary people in London were writing in Greek and reading in Greek. And it sort of seems trust me, don't really think about it like that. It sort of seems suddenly, oh yes, there are people reading Greek, there are people writing Greek, there are people reading Greek literature in Rome and London. So that was quite an important discovery in terms of the poetry and the people that I imagined within it.
Lovely. We have another question from Lorna Hardwick for both of you. What have been the main changes or shifts of perspective in your lifelong engagement with classical material? And have you got future plans, Gia?
Oh, well, that's a really good question, Laura. Hi. I think things have changed dramatically, really, and since I translated Sappho in 1984. I mean, there's so much more now that we understand, I think, about the verse. There's so much more that we actually understand about the text. So just in a very basic sense, scholarship has moved on hugely. The way, I think, that this sort of is a little bit of a I don't know, a sort of paradox. I think when I was younger, I took more risks because I didn't know, I was fearless. So I didn't really know the right way to do it. I just did it the way that seemed right at the time to me. So I wasn't worrying so much about everyone else's opinion. But as I've got older, perhaps I worry more about about whether what I'm doing is right. But I think also as you gain more experience, you gain more confidence as well, so that your engagement with the text becomes more creative and becomes less about, this is a translation for the Penguin Classics or whatever, and this is actually a poem that uses translation as part of its skill set. And I think that's one of the ways in which my work has changed a lot. Lesley.
That's really interesting. I think something that's happened for me is to understand that there is a whole field of studies called classical reception, which because I didn't have a career in classics at all. I worked in educational research, and then to come across an extraordinary volume just a few years ago of classical reception studies essays, I suddenly thought, oh, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to kind of situate my own experience of learning Latin and Greek in some kind of context which isn't confined to dusty grammar books or to feeling intimidated, actually, because I ended up at a university where most of the other undergraduates had been studying classics since prep school. And for a long time, I felt completely inadequate to the task. And then in my older age, I decided I wanted to revisit the pleasure, the oral and aural pleasure that I experienced in my teenage years. And that was a sort of a liberation. As to the future, I have no particular plans, partly because I'm in the middle of moving house and I don't have any plans apart from just getting things in boxes. But I know that I will take all my classics books with me. They are a part of me. I will take them with me. I hope to be able to reread them. But I know in any case that the whole way that I see the world is somehow, I see it partly through that classical lens, the classical myths. In a sense, we can't help it. It becomes part of our mindset in a way. So it won't ever leave me, even if I never go back and do anything formal again.
Jo, I don't know whether you shared your future plans or if you have any that you want to share with us.
I don't really have any at the moment. I've just brought out a book literally a week ago. So yeah, I'm pondering. I'm working on, well, I'm working on some translations of the Cyclades, but that's sort of very much in the early stage. But poetry-wise, yeah, watch this space, I think.
Well, I do hope that we will be able to invite both of you back to share the fruits of those future projects down the line. Lesley, after you've moved, and Jo, after you've translated Bacchylides and reworked Bacchylides. So thank you again for a really, really wonderful session. And thanks on behalf of the whole team. And as you pointed out, Jo, at the beginning, there is quite a team behind. So thanks to Claire, thanks to Selina, thanks to Estelle, all of whom have made this possible. And above all, thanks to you wonderful poets for having been so generous with your time today. Thank you.
Fiona. Thank you.
Great pleasure. Great pleasure.
Absolutely.